31 days of silence, a grandmother's desperate 911 call, a child's remains hidden in plain sight, just blocks from home. In the summer of 2008, suburban Orlando became the epicenter of America's most divisive murder case. What began as a missing person report evolved into a trial that would fracture a nation's faith in justice itself. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted, but the truth about what happened to 2-year-old Caylee Anthony remained as elusive as ever. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The Anthony house on Hope Spring Drive sat nestled in suburban Orlando, like any other manicured lawn, cheerful mailbox, the kind of place where children rode bicycles and neighbors waved from driveways. Inside, 2-year-old Caylee Marie Anthony played with her toys, while her grandmother, Cindy, prepared dinner. The evening light of June 15, 2008, filtered through kitchen windows. As 3 generations of the Anthony family moved through their routine, Caylee's laughter echoed through the hallways, her small voice calling out to her mother, Casey, who moved between rooms with practiced indifference. Cindy watched her granddaughter with protective eyes. The child had become the center of her world since Casey's return home after high school. George Anthony, Caylee's grandfather, worked in the garage, the familiar sounds of suburban life surrounding him. This moment, ordinary, unremarkable, filled with the gentle chaos of family life, would become the last known instance of normalcy before everything shattered. In the weeks that followed, the Anthony household would transform from private sanctuary to public battlefield, where truth and deception collided under the relentless gaze of a nation desperate for answers. But on this June evening, none of them could foresee the storm approaching. Caylee played, Cindy cooked, Casey moved through the house like smoke there, but somehow untouchable. The calm before the devastation was complete. 31 days passed in a blur of manufactured normalcy. Casey Anthony carried on as if nothing had changed, attending parties, visiting friends, posting photographs on social media that showed a young woman enjoying her freedom. Her parents, George and Cindy, remained unaware that their granddaughter was gone. The illusion shattered on July 15, 2008, when Cindy's hands trembled as she dialed 911. Her voice, recorded and replayed thousands of times in the years that followed, carried desperation that cut through phone lines like a blade. "I have not seen my granddaughter in over a month," she told the dispatcher, her words tumbling over each other. "My daughter finally admitted that the babysitter stole her. I need to find her." But it was Cindy's next statement that would haunt the investigation. "There's something wrong. I found my daughter's car today, and it smells like there's a dead body in the damn car." Detectives arrived at the Anthony home within the hour, their practiced eyes taking in every detail. Casey Anthony sat in the living room, her demeanor striking them immediately, not frantic like a mother whose child had vanished, but detached, almost bored. When they asked about Caylee's whereabouts, her answers came too smoothly, too rehearsed. The car, a white Pontiac Sunfire that had been abandoned at a tow yard, became their first piece of evidence. Even before opening the trunk, the odor was unmistakable to experienced investigators. Something had decomposed inside that vehicle, and whatever it wasn't animal remains. In the sterile interview room at the Orange County Sheriff's Office, detective began peeling back layers of Casey Anthony's story. She spoke of a babysitter named Zenaida Gonzalez, nicknamed Zanny, who had supposedly taken Caylee to a beach vacation and never returned. Her voice remained steady as she provided an address where Zanny supposedly lived. When investigators drove to the apartment complex, they found the unit empty. It had been vacant for months. Phone numbers Casey provided led to dead ends. Co-workers, she claimed, could vouch for Zanny's existence, had never heard the name. With each failed verification, the detective's suspicion deepened. Casey's cell phone records painted a troubling picture. In the 31 days when she claimed to be searching desperately for her daughter, her calls and text messages revealed a different story. Plans for parties, casual conversations with friends, even romantic exchanges with multiple men. Not a single call to police, not one plea for help finding her missing child. The detective confronted Casey with these inconsistencies. Her responses shifted like sand, new details appearing, previous claims evaporating. When pressed about why she hadn't called police immediately, Casey claimed she was conducting her own investigation, following Zanny's trail. When asked why her phone records showed no evidence of this search, she grew defensive, then silent. Hours passed in that interview room. Outside, news vans were already gathering in the police station parking lot, drawn by whispers of a missing toddler and a mother whose story didn't add up. The detective knew they were sitting across from someone hiding the truth, but the depth of that deception was only beginning to reveal itself. Crime scene technicians swarmed Casey's Pontiac like forensic archaeologists, photographing, measuring, and collecting every trace of evidence. The vehicle had been impounded from Johnson's wrecker service, where it had sat for days after being towed from a parking lot near Orlando's airport. The smell that had overwhelmed the tow yard workers now guided the investigation. Inside the trunk, technicians discovered a single hair 19 inches long, medium brown, consistent with Caylee Anthony's hair color and length. Under microscopic examination, the hair revealed something extraordinary, a dark band near the root end that forensic experts called a death band, a phenomenon that allegedly occurred only after death when cellular decomposition began. The significance of this discovery rippled through the investigative team. If the hair belonged to Caylee and displayed post-mortem banding, it suggested she had been dead and placed in the trunk of her mother's car. The hair was carefully preserved and prepared for DNA analysis, though mitochondrial testing would take weeks to complete. Air samples from the trunk were collected in specialized canisters, preserving whatever molecular traces remained of the decomposition odor. These samples would later be analyzed by Dr. Arpad Vas, a pioneer in the emerging science of decomposition chemistry. His findings would become among the most controversial evidence in the trial that followed. As technicians worked, news helicopters circled overhead, transforming from local missing person case to national obsession. Headlines across Central Florida screamed questions that investigators were only beginning to formulate. Where was Caylee Anthony? What had happened in those 31 days of silence? And why had her mother waited so long to report her missing? On October 14, 2008, the Orange County Grand Jury returned an indictment that stunned even those who had followed the case closely. Casey Marie Anthony was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers. The first-degree murder charge carried the possibility of the death penalty, a fact that sent shockwaves through the community and transformed the case from tragedy to potential execution. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered with homemade signs demanding justice for Caylee. Cable news programs interrupted regular programming to report the indictment live. Casey Anthony's arrest was captured by news cameras stationed outside the Orange County Jail. Her stoic expression as deputies led her away in handcuffs became an iconic image, one that would be analyzed and debated by criminal psychologists, body language experts, and millions of Americans forming their own opinions about her guilt or innocence. Inside the jail, Casey was placed on suicide watch, though she showed no signs of emotional breakdown. Guards reported that she ate regularly, slept without apparent nightmares, and showed little interest in news coverage of her case. Her calm demeanor, while facing potential execution, struck many observers as either evidence of innocence or confirmation of sociopathic behavior. The indictment also charged Casey with lying to investigators specifically about the existence of Zenaida Gonzalez, about her employment at Universal Studios, about leaving Caylee with the babysitter, and about conducting her own search for her daughter. These seemingly minor charges would prove crucial as the case developed, offering prosecutors a potential conviction even if they couldn't prove murder. Public reaction was swift and harsh. Social media platforms filled with angry posts demanding justice for Caylee. Television pundits debated Casey's guilt nightly, often reaching conclusions that far exceeded available evidence. The Anthony family found themselves prisoners in their own home, surrounded by protesters and news crews documenting their every movement. December 11, 2008. Dawned gray and humid in Central Florida. Roy Kronk, a utility worker conducting routine meter readings in a wooded area along Suburban Drive, noticed something that stopped him cold. Partially hidden beneath palmetto fronds and scattered debris, a small skull stared back at him through empty sockets. Kronk immediately called 911, his voice shaking as he reported finding what appeared to be human remains. Within minutes, Orange County Sheriff's deputies secured the scene, their yellow tape creating a perimeter around an area that had been searched multiple times during the initial investigation but somehow overlooked. The medical examiner arrived first, followed by forensic anthropologists, who began the delicate process of recovery. What they found painted a horrific picture: skeletal remains inside a canvas laundry bag, along with a child's clothing and 3 pieces of duct tape. The skull showed clear evidence of duct tape placement, one piece over what would have been the mouth area, another across the orbital sockets. The location was heartbreakingly close to the Anthony home, less than half a mile from Hope Spring Drive, hidden in a wooded area where children often played and families walked their dogs. For 6 months, Caylee Anthony's remains had lain there, while investigators pursued leads across 3 states, and the media speculated about her fate. Dr. John Garavaglia, the Orange County medical examiner, was called to the scene personally, an unusual step that underscored the case's significance. Her initial examination confirmed what everyone feared. The remains belonged to a child, approximately Caylee's age, and the duct tape suggested homicide. Advanced decomposition had eliminated soft tissue, making definitive identification dependent on dental records and DNA analysis. News of the discovery spread through Orlando like wildfire. At the Orange County Jail, Casey Anthony was informed that remains had been found near her family home. Jail cameras recorded her reaction, or lack thereof. She showed no visible emotion, asked no questions, and returned to reading a book as if nothing had happened. The wooded scene where Caylee was found became a shrine within hours. Strangers left flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes expressing grief for a child they had never met but had come to symbolize innocence destroyed. The discovery marked the end of hope that Caylee might still be alive, and the beginning of a legal battle that would divide the nation. The autopsy of Caylee Anthony took place under unprecedented security and media attention. Dr. Jan Garavaglia, known to television audiences as Dr. G, approached the examination with methodical precision, knowing that every finding would be scrutinized by defense experts and dissected in courtrooms. The skeletal remains told a story of violence but withheld crucial details. Duct tape adhered to the skull in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement over the nose and mouth consistent with suffocation. The mandible had detached but was found with additional duct tape, creating what appeared to be a binding that would have prevented speech or breathing. However, advanced decomposition had eliminated soft tissue, blood, and organs that might have revealed the exact cause of death. No chloroform residue could be detected. No fibers or DNA that definitively linked the remains to Casey Anthony. The duct tape itself, when processed by the FBI laboratory, yielded no usable fingerprints or DNA evidence. Dr. Garavaglia's official determination was homicide. The manner of death was clearly violent, but the specific mechanism remained undetermined. This gap between obvious violence and provable cause would become a central challenge for prosecutors and a key defense argument about the limits of forensic evidence. The child's clothing found with the remains, a pink shirt with the word "Big Trouble" printed across the front, became a haunting symbol that media outlets displayed repeatedly. The irony was lost on no one. Caylee Anthony had indeed found big trouble, but whether at the hands of her mother or some unknown perpetrator remained unclear. As news of the autopsy findings spread, public emotion intensified. The image of duct tape over a child's skull proved more powerful than any legal argument. Outside the courthouse, protesters carried enlarged photographs of Caylee, demanding justice for a 2-year-old who could no longer speak for herself. The case had evolved from missing person investigation to murder prosecution, but the gap between moral certainty and legal proof was widening. The months leading up to trial were consumed by legal warfare over evidence admissibility. Jose Baez, Casey Anthony's lead defense attorney, filed motion after motion, challenging the forensic science that would form the foundation of the prosecution's case. His strategy was clear: attack the reliability of emerging forensic techniques and expose the gaps between scientific possibility and courtroom certainty. The hair evidence became a particular battleground. Defense experts argued that death banding was not scientifically validated, pointing to studies showing similar banding could occur in living individuals under certain conditions. They demanded access to the FBI's protocols for death band analysis and questioned whether a single hair without a root could yield meaningful conclusions. Air quality analysis faced similar challenges. Dr. Arpad Vass's decomposition chemistry research was pioneering but largely untested in criminal courts. Defense motions argued that his techniques were experimental, lacking peer review and standardized protocols. Prosecutors countered that innovative science often outpaced legal precedent, and that Vass's findings, while new, were methodologically sound. The duct tape evidence spawned its own legal battles. Defense experts wanted access to the original tape for independent analysis, claiming that FBI processing had contaminated potential DNA evidence. They argued that the tape's placement on the skull could have occurred during decomposition or even during the recovery process, rather than as a deliberate act of violence. Media coverage during this pretrial period intensified public opinion on both sides. Legal analysts dissected every motion on cable news programs, often reaching conclusions about evidence they had never seen. Social media platforms became battlegrounds, where amateur investigators debated forensic science with passionate certainty. Judge Belvin Perry Jr., newly assigned to the case, worked to maintain order amid chaos. His courtroom would soon become the stage for one of the most watched trials in American history, where scientific evidence and emotional truth would collide before a jury tasked with determining not just guilt or innocence, but life or death. May 24, 2011, marked the beginning of what legal experts would later call one of the most closely watched murder trials in American history. The Orange County Courthouse was transformed into a fortress of security, metal detectors, and media credentials. Outside, protesters maintained a vigil that had lasted nearly 3 years, their signs demanding justice for Caylee Anthony. The jury had been selected in Clearwater, Florida, 120 miles from Orlando, due to intense local publicity that made finding impartial jurors nearly impossible in Orange County. 12 citizens and 5 alternates were bused to Orlando under sheriff's protection, sequestered for the duration of what everyone expected to be a lengthy trial. Inside the packed courtroom, families sat on opposite sides like wedding guests, divided by allegiance. Cindy and George Anthony, flanked by victim advocates, occupied the front row behind prosecutors. Their faces showed the strain of 3 years spent in the eye of a media hurricane, their grief now displayed for court cameras and a watching nation. Casey Anthony entered wearing a conservative business suit, her long hair pulled back severely. She had lost significant weight during her incarceration, her face gaunt but composed. At the defense table, she sat between Jose Baez and Cheney Mason, her expression neutral as photographers captured every angle. Judge Belvin Perry's voice echoed through the silent courtroom as he called the proceedings to order. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "we are here today to determine the truth in the matter of the state of Florida versus Casey Marie Anthony." Those words marked the beginning of 6 weeks that would captivate the nation and challenge fundamental assumptions about justice, truth, and the burden of proof in American courts. Television coverage was gavel to gavel, transforming legal proceedings into daily entertainment for millions of viewers. The Anthony trial was becoming more than a criminal case. It was evolving into a national referendum on motherhood, morality, and the price of reasonable doubt. Assistant State Attorney Linda Drain Burdick rose to present the prosecution's opening statement, her voice steady and prosecutorial, as she outlined a theory of murder that would horrify and convince millions of Americans watching live television coverage. Casey Anthony killed her daughter, Caylee, Burdick stated with quiet certainty. She used chloroform to sedate her, then placed duct tape over her nose and mouth until she could no longer breathe. She did this because Caylee had become an obstacle to the life she wanted to live, a life of freedom, parties, and men that didn't include the responsibility of motherhood. Burdick methodically presented the state's narrative. Internet searches for chloroform and neck-breaking methods conducted from the Anthony home computer, the smell of death in Casey's car, the 31 days of lies while she partied and socialized, and finally the discovery of Caylee's remains with duct tape covering her skull. "The defendant will claim this was an accident," Burdick continued, "but accidents don't require duct tape. Accidents don't require 31 days of lies. Accidents don't require chloroform searches or elaborate stories about babysitters who never existed." Her words carried the weight of prosecutorial authority, each point building toward a conclusion that seemed inevitable. The prosecution's theory resonated powerfully with public opinion. Cable news programs dissected Burdick's presentation for hours, with legal experts praising her methodical approach and compelling narrative. Social media exploded with expressions of outrage and support for the prosecution's case. But in the jury box, 12 faces remained carefully neutral. These citizens, insulated from the media storm surrounding the trial, would judge the evidence by different standards than the court of public opinion. They would demand proof, not just compelling theory, and they would soon hear a defense narrative that would challenge every assumption the prosecution had presented. The battle lines were drawn: science versus emotion, proof versus suspicion, truth versus reasonable doubt. What followed would test the American justice system's fundamental promise: that guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt, regardless of public opinion or emotional truth. Jose Baez's opening statement began with a bombshell that stunned even veteran court observers. Caylee Anthony died on June 16, 2008, when she drowned in her family's swimming pool he declared, his voice carrying absolute conviction. But this case is not about how she died. This case is about the dysfunction and lies that followed her accidental death. The courtroom erupted in whispers as Baez continued his narrative. Casey Anthony, finding her daughter floating in the pool, panicked and called her father, George Anthony. Together, they decided to cover up the accident, fearing that Casey would be blamed for neglectful supervision. The elaborate lies about babysitters and the 31 days of silence were products of this desperate cover-up, not evidence of murder. But Baez wasn't finished with his revelations. You will learn that Casey Anthony was raised in a home where sexual abuse occurred, he stated, looking directly at the jury, where sexual abuse by her father, George Anthony, warped her ability to tell the truth and created the dysfunctional response you see in this case. George Anthony, seated in the front row, visibly recoiled as if struck. Cindy Anthony grabbed his arm, her face contorted in shock and horror. The allegation of sexual abuse had been rumored for months, but never stated so directly in open court. Now it hung in the air like poisonous smoke, transforming family grief into something darker and more complex. Defense experts would argue that the forensic evidence was either misinterpreted or contaminated, Baez explained. The smell in Casey's car came from garbage, not decomposition. The duct tape was placed on the skull by someone else, possibly during the cover-up George Anthony helped orchestrate. The internet searches were either misattributed or taken out of context. At the end of this trial, Baez concluded, and when you have reasonable doubt, you must find Casey Anthony not guilty. His words carried the confidence of an attorney who believed he could dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece, creating enough uncertainty to save his client's life. The defense strategy was clear. Transform Casey Anthony from calculating killer to victim of family dysfunction and prosecutorial overreach. Whether the jury would accept this alternative narrative remained to be seen, but the battle for reasonable doubt had officially begun. The first week of testimony focused on the forensic evidence that prosecutors claimed proved murder. FBI Special Agent Karen Lowe presented the hair analysis that had captivated investigators since Casey's car was first processed. Under direct examination, she explained how the single hair found in the trunk showed characteristics consistent with post-mortem root banding. This banding pattern, Agent Lowe testified, occurs when cellular decomposition begins after death. In my experience examining thousands of hair samples, I have never observed this pattern in hair from a living person. Her testimony was accompanied by microscopic photographs that showed the dark band near the hair's root, evidence that seemed to prove Kaylee had been dead when placed in her mother's car. But cross-examination revealed the limitations of hair analysis. Defense attorney Cheney Mason pressed Agent Lowe on the lack of nuclear DNA in the hair sample, the absence of published standards for death banding, and the fact that the FBI's own protocols admitted the analysis was subjective. Isn't it true, Mason asked, that you cannot definitively state when this alleged death banding occurred, or even confirm that it indicates death rather than some other process? The courtroom watched as Agent Lowe's certainty eroded under questioning. She admitted that death banding analysis lacked standardized protocols, that peer-reviewed studies were limited, and that the timing of band formation was unknown. What had seemed like definitive proof of murder became, under defense scrutiny, an educated guess based on emerging science. Media coverage of this testimony revealed the divide between public perception and courtroom reality. Television legal experts debated the strength of hair evidence for hours, often reaching different conclusions about the same testimony. The public, hungry for certainty, struggled with the nuanced reality that forensic science often offered probability rather than proof. As the forensic testimony continued, a pattern emerged. Prosecution evidence that seemed compelling in theory faced significant challenges when subjected to defense cross-examination. The gap between scientific possibility and courtroom certainty was becoming a chasm that prosecutors would struggle to bridge. The prosecution's case reached its most critical moment when digital forensics expert Detective Yuri Melich took the stand to present evidence of internet searches conducted from the Anthony family computer. His testimony promised to reveal the premeditation that would transform accidental death into first-degree murder. On March 17, 2008, Detective Melich testified, someone conducted internet searches for how to make chloroform inhalation, and death. These searches occurred during daytime hours, when Casey Anthony would have been home, alone with Kaylee. His presentation included computer screenshots and browser history logs that seemed to document a mother researching methods to kill her child. The chloroform searches had become central to the prosecution's theory of premeditation. If Casey Anthony had researched chloroform months before Kaylee's death, it suggested planning rather than impulse. Combined with testimony about chloroform traces allegedly found in her car trunk, these searches appeared to complete a narrative of calculated murder. But defense expert witness John Bradley, a computer forensics specialist, exposed critical flaws in the timeline analysis. Under oath, Bradley revealed that the forensic software used by investigators had miscounted search frequency and incorrectly attributed timing to specific searches. What police had initially claimed were multiple chloroform searches conducted over several days actually represented a single search session lasting minutes. More damaging still, Bradley's analysis revealed that the search for how to make chloroform was immediately preceded by searches for chlorophyll and followed by searches for skateboarding websites. The sequence suggested casual internet browsing rather than murder planning, possibly triggered by a joke from a television show or online meme. The state's timeline is fundamentally flawed. Bradley testified, the software they used has known issues with Internet Explorer cache analysis, and their conclusions about search frequency and timing are incorrect. His words struck the prosecution's premeditation theory like a sledgehammer, destroying the digital foundation they had built their case upon. Judge Perry called a recess as prosecutors huddled in urgent conference. Their strongest evidence of premeditation, the proof that Casey Anthony had planned her daughter's murder, was crumbling under technical scrutiny. Defense attorneys exchanged subtle glances, recognizing that the momentum of the trial had shifted dramatically. Outside the courthouse, legal experts struggled to explain the significance of the forensics revelation to television audiences. The public, which had been following the case with certainty about Casey's guilt, suddenly faced the possibility that the evidence was far weaker than prosecutors had claimed. Dr. Arpad Vas took the witness stand, carrying the burden of revolutionary science and prosecution hopes. His testimony about decomposition chemistry would either validate the smell of death in Casey's car or expose the limits of forensic innovation when applied to criminal law. Vas explained his groundbreaking research at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where he had analyzed the chemical compounds released during human decomposition. His work had identified specific molecules, including chloroform, carbonyl sulfide, and other organic compounds, that distinguished human decay from animal decomposition or other odors. I analyzed air samples taken from the defendant's vehicle, Vas testified, and found chemical signatures consistent with human decomposition. Specifically, I detected chloroform levels significantly higher than normal atmospheric concentrations. His scientific credentials were impeccable. A Ph.D. in analytical chemistry, decades of research, and publications in peer-reviewed journals. But the defense's cross-examination revealed the experimental nature of Vas's techniques. Defense attorney Jose Baez pressed him on the lack of published standards for his analysis, the absence of control studies, and the fact that his methods had never been validated in independent laboratories. Isn't it true, Doctor, Baez asked, that your decomposition research lacks certain key compounds that your own studies identified as necessary for human decay detection? Vas admitted that critical compounds like undecane were absent from the car trunk samples, weakening his conclusions about human decomposition. The scientific battle continued for hours, as defense experts attacked Vas's methodology and interpretation. They argued that chloroform could result from cleaning products, that decomposition chemistry was too new for courtroom application, and that the absence of key compounds undermined any definitive conclusions. Jury faces showed visible confusion as competing experts offered contradictory interpretations of the same evidence. The promise of scientific certainty was dissolving into technical debates that highlighted the limits of forensic innovation. What had seemed like proof of death was becoming an argument about the reliability of emerging science. Television coverage struggled to explain the complex chemistry to audiences, expecting clear answers. Legal commentators debated whether innovative science should be admitted in criminal trials before achieving widespread scientific acceptance. The Vas testimony had become a referendum on the role of cutting-edge forensics in murder prosecutions. As prosecution witnesses continued their testimony, the defense strategy of systematic evidence destruction began taking its toll. Cross-examinations revealed contamination issues with the duct tape, chain of custody problems with crucial evidence, and investigative oversights that had allowed potential leads to go unexplored. Detective Yuri Melich, the lead investigator, faced particularly aggressive questioning about the initial search of the wooded area, where Kaylee's remains were eventually found. Defense attorneys established that multiple searches of the area had occurred in the months following Kaylee's disappearance, yet the remains were not discovered until December 11, raising questions about whether they had been placed there after the initial searches. Detective, Defense Attorney Cheney Mason pressed, "Your initial search of this area found nothing, correct?" Melich confirmed that multiple agencies had searched the wooded area with dogs, helicopters, and ground personnel. Yet 6 months later, remains are found in the same location by a utility worker. Does that seem suspicious to you? The prosecution struggled to explain how such a thorough search had missed remains that were later found in plain sight. Their attempts to suggest that flooding had uncovered the bones seemed weak against defense arguments that someone had placed them there after the initial investigation. Forensic testimony about the duct tape faced similar challenges. Defense experts argued that the tape's placement on the skull could have occurred during decomposition, transportation, or even during the recovery process. FBI analysis had failed to recover any DNA or fingerprints from the tape, eliminating the possibility of definitively linking it to Casey Anthony. Crime scene photographs became a source of dispute rather than clarity. Defense attorneys pointed out inconsistencies in evidence documentation, questioned the chain of custody for crucial items, and highlighted the degraded condition of evidence that had been exposed to Florida weather for months. The cumulative effect of these challenges was devastating to prosecution confidence. Evidence that had seemed ironclad during investigation was revealing significant weaknesses under courtroom scrutiny. Defense attorneys had successfully planted seeds of doubt about every major piece of forensic evidence. Outside the courthouse, public opinion began to shift as news coverage highlighted the problems with prosecution evidence. Social media discussions evolved from certainty about Casey's guilt to confusion about the strength of the case. The narrative of obvious guilt was becoming complicated by technical realities. By the 4th week of trial, the community surrounding the courthouse had become a living symbol of America's divided conscience. Protesters maintained their vigil with signs reading, "Justice for Kaylee," while counter-protesters appeared with messages supporting fair trials and reasonable doubt. The sidewalks became a battleground of competing beliefs about guilt, innocence, and the meaning of justice. Inside the courtroom, family dynamics reflected the broader social divisions. George and Cindy Anthony sat rigid in the front row, their faces masks of grief and confusion as defense allegations about sexual abuse and cover-ups swirled around them. Their marriage, already strained by 3 years of public scrutiny, was visibly fracturing under the weight of courtroom revelations. Casey Anthony herself remained eerily calm throughout testimony that described her as either a calculating killer or a victim of family dysfunction. Court observers noted her apparent lack of emotion, as witnesses described, finding her daughter's skeletal remains and the duct tape that had covered Kaylee's skull. Her detachment became another piece of evidence in the public's assessment of her character. Television coverage had transformed the trial into daily entertainment for millions of Americans. Cable news programs provided hour-by-hour analysis, with legal experts offering conflicting interpretations of the same testimony. Social media platforms buzzed with amateur investigations and passionate debates about evidence and motives. The intense media attention created its own pressure on the legal proceedings. Attorneys played to cameras as much as to the jury, understanding that public opinion would shape their careers long after the verdict. Judge Perry struggled to maintain courtroom dignity while accommodating the unprecedented media presence. The sequestered jury remained insulated from the public frenzy, but their faces during testimony revealed the emotional toll of weighing evidence about child murder. Court observers noted that several jurors appeared visibly disturbed by crime scene photographs and expert testimony about decomposition and death. As the prosecution's case neared its conclusion, the gap between public certainty and courtroom proof had become a chasm. Evidence that seemed compelling in newspaper headlines was revealing significant weaknesses under legal scrutiny. The Anthony trial was becoming a lesson in the difference between moral conviction and judicial proof. The closing arguments began on July 3, 2011, as a nation held its breath. Assistant State Attorney Linda Drain Burdick faced the enormous challenge of weaving weeks of complicated and often contradictory evidence into a coherent narrative of guilt that would convince 12 jurors to potentially sentence Casey Anthony to death. Kaylee Marie Anthony died because her mother, Casey Anthony, decided that her life would be better without her daughter, Burdick declared, her voice carrying 3 years of prosecutorial conviction. She researched chloroform on the internet. She used that chloroform to sedate Kaylee. She placed duct tape over her mouth and nose until she could no longer breathe. And then she threw her away like garbage in a wooded area blocks from her home. Burdick methodically reviewed the evidence. The smell of death in Casey's car, the hair with alleged death banding, the chloroform searches, the 31 days of lies, and the duct tape found with Kaylee's remains. Each piece of evidence tells the same story, she argued. Casey Anthony murdered her daughter because Kaylee had become an obstacle to the life she wanted to live. The prosecutor addressed defense arguments about accidental drowning and family dysfunction with prosecutorial scorn. Accidents don't require chloroform, she repeated. Accidents don't require duct tape. Accidents don't require 31 days of partying while your child decomposes in a trunk. Her words carried the moral, trunded outrage that had driven public opinion for 3 years. But even as Burdick spoke, observers noted the defensive tone of her argument. Rather than presenting overwhelming evidence of guilt, she was responding to defense challenges about forensic reliability and investigative oversights. The prosecution's case, which had seemed ironclad in 2008, was requiring passionate advocacy rather than simple presentation of facts. The weight of circumstantial evidence versus reasonable doubt would soon rest with 12 citizens who had watched the American justice system struggle with the difference between moral certainty and legal proof. Jose Baez's closing argument began with a direct challenge to the jury's emotions and the prosecution's narrative. "They want you to kill Casey Anthony," he stated bluntly, referring to prosecutors' request for the death penalty. "But you cannot sentence someone to death based on fantasy forensics, unreliable evidence, and prosecutorial desperation." Baez systematically dismantled the prosecution's case, piece by piece. The hair evidence was unreliable science, he argued. Death banding analysis lacked scientific validation and could not definitively prove when or how death occurred. The chloroform searches were misrepresented by flawed computer analysis, representing casual internet browsing rather than murder planning. "Where is the evidence that Casey Anthony killed her daughter?" Baez asked the jury. "Not theories, not speculation, not fantasy forensics. Where is the actual evidence? There is no DNA evidence linking Casey to Kaylee's death. There is no chloroform residue in the car. There are no fingerprints on the duct tape. There is no murder weapon. There is no witness to any crime." Baez reminded the jury that George Anthony had been the last person seen with Kaylee, alive, on June 16, 2008. He emphasized the defense theory that Kaylee had drowned accidentally in the family pool, and that George had helped cover up the death to protect Casey from blame. The sexual abuse allegations, while impossible to prove, provided context for Casey's dysfunctional response to trauma. "The state wants you to hate Casey Anthony," Baez continued, "because if you hate her enough, maybe you'll ignore the lack of evidence. Maybe you'll convict based on emotion rather than proof. But that's not how our justice system works. You cannot convict someone of murder because you don't like how they acted after a tragedy." The defense attorney concluded with an appeal to the jury's obligation under law. "When you have reasonable doubt, and after seeing this evidence, you must have reasonable doubt, you have no choice but to find Casey Anthony not guilty. That is not just your right as jurors, it is your duty under the Constitution." Outside the courthouse, protesters maintained their vigil as legal experts debated the strength of both closing arguments. The nation prepared for a verdict that would either validate public outrage or demonstrate the limits of circumstantial evidence in criminal law. Jury deliberation began on July 4, 2011, Independence Day, a date that would later seem symbolic of the verdict that followed. 12 citizens entered the deliberation room, carrying the weight of national expectation and 3 years of media coverage that had proclaimed Casey Anthony's guilt as obvious truth. The deliberation was remarkably brief for such a complex case. 10 hours and 40 minutes total, spread across 2 days, with no requests for transcript review or evidence clarification. Court observers noted that the jury asked for no additional information about the forensic evidence that had consumed weeks of testimony. Their lack of questions suggested either clarity in their decision or fundamental problems with the prosecution's case. Judge Belvin Perry maintained strict security around the courthouse as rumors of an impending verdict spread through Orlando. Protesters gathered in larger numbers, many carrying signs demanding justice for Caylee. Television news trucks filled every available parking space, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like technological flowers seeking connection to a nation waiting for resolution. Inside the deliberation room, jurors later revealed, the discussions focused heavily on the lack of direct evidence linking Casey Anthony to her daughter's death. The circumstantial case that had seemed compelling in media coverage proved insufficient when subjected to the legal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt. Foreman David Etheridge later explained that the jury found the prosecution's theory of chloroform murder inconsistent with the forensic evidence. The absence of chloroform residue in Casey's car, the questionable reliability of decomposition chemistry, and the lack of DNA evidence on the duct tape created too many gaps in the prosecution's narrative. The brevity of deliberation shocked legal experts, who had predicted days or weeks of discussion about the complex forensic evidence. Instead, the jury had apparently reached consensus quickly about the insufficiency of proof for murder charges. Their rapid decision would soon send shockwaves through a nation convinced of Casey Anthony's guilt. At 2:15 p.m. on July 5, 2011, Judge Belvin Perry's voice echoed through a courtroom packed beyond capacity. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? Foreman David Etheridge rose with a folded paper that would shatter 3 years of national certainty about justice and truth. We have, Your Honor. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter of a child, only on 4 misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement officers was Casey Anthony found guilty. The words hit the courtroom like physical blows. Spectators gasped audibly. George and Cindy Anthony sat stunned, their faces reflecting disbelief and renewed grief. Behind them, victim advocates struggled to comfort family members who had expected justice and received legal acquittal instead. Casey Anthony's reaction was equally shocking. Tears flowed down her face for the first time during the trial, but they appeared to be tears of relief rather than grief. Her defense team embraced as cameras captured every emotion in the most-watched verdict reading in American television history. Outside the courthouse, the crowd's reaction was immediate and violent. "Justice for Caylee," protesters chanted, their voices mixing anger and disbelief. Some threw objects at the courthouse steps. Police formed protective barriers as the crowd swelled with citizens who felt betrayed by a system they had trusted to deliver obvious justice. Legal experts on television struggled to explain the verdict to audiences who had been led to believe that Casey Anthony's guilt was unquestionable. Social media platforms exploded with expressions of outrage that ranged from disappointment to threats of vigilante justice. The disconnect between public certainty and jury doubt had created a crisis of faith in the American legal system. Judge Perry scheduled sentencing for July 7, but the damage to public trust was immediate and profound. The Casey Anthony verdict had become more than a legal decision. It was a national reckoning with the difference between emotional truth and courtroom proof. 12 days after her acquittal on murder charges, Casey Anthony walked out of the Orange County Jail as a free woman. Judge Perry had sentenced her to 4 years for the misdemeanor convictions, but with credit for time served and good behavior, her incarceration was complete. The woman who had become America's most hated mother was returning to a world that remained convinced of her guilt. The release occurred under extraordinary security measures. Sheriff's deputies arranged a decoy convoy while Casey left through a different exit, but news helicopters tracked her movements from overhead. Protesters had maintained their vigil outside the jail for days, their signs now reading, "Killer Casey walks free," and demanding continued vigilante justice. Casey's first destination remained secret, but her legal team had spent weeks arranging safe houses and security protocols for a woman who had received thousands of death threats. Public anger over her acquittal had transformed her from defendant to permanent exile, unable to live openly in the society that had declared her morally guilty, regardless of legal verdict. The Anthony family home on Hope Spring Drive had become uninhabitable due to constant protests and media attention. George and Cindy Anthony announced their intention to move away from Orlando, seeking privacy to grieve their granddaughter without public scrutiny. Their marriage, strained beyond recognition by 3 years of legal proceedings and family accusations, struggled to survive the aftermath of acquittal. Public reaction to Casey's release was swift and sustained. Boycotts targeted any business rumored to employ her. Social media campaigns tracked her movements and published alleged sightings. The concept of presumed innocence, fundamental to American justice, had been overwhelmed by moral conviction that transcended legal findings. Legal experts used the Casey Anthony case as a teaching moment about the difference between civil and criminal standards of proof. In civil court, where the standard was preponderance of evidence rather than beyond reasonable doubt, the outcome might have been different. But criminal law demanded certainty that the evidence had failed to provide. The release marked the beginning rather than the end of Casey Anthony's punishment. Legal acquittal had not delivered social forgiveness, and she would spend the remainder of her life as a symbol of justice denied, rather than innocence proven. In the weeks following the verdict, America struggled to process a legal outcome that contradicted 3 years of media narrative and public certainty. Legal scholars appeared on television programs attempting to explain reasonable doubt to audiences who viewed the acquittal as evidence of systemic failure rather than constitutional protection. The case spawned immediate calls for legal reform. Caylee's Law was proposed in multiple states, requiring parents to report missing children within specific timeframes under penalty of felony charges. Legislators argued that Casey Anthony's 31 days of silence had hindered the investigation and might have cost Caylee her life if she had still been alive but kidnapped. Forensic science faced renewed scrutiny as experts debated whether innovative techniques like decomposition chemistry and hair death banding should be admitted in criminal trials before achieving widespread scientific acceptance. The Anthony case had exposed the gap between cutting-edge research and courtroom reliability. Media coverage evolved from trial reporting to soul-searching about the role of television in shaping public opinion about pending criminal cases. The extensive coverage of the Anthony case had created a parallel trial in the court of public opinion, where standards of evidence differed dramatically from legal requirements. Social media analysis revealed the extent to which the case had divided Americans along philosophical lines about justice, motherhood, and the burden of proof. Facebook groups dedicated to proving Casey Anthony's guilt attracted millions of members, while smaller communities defended the jury's application of reasonable doubt. Criminal defense attorneys across the nation reported increased difficulty in jury selection as potential jurors cited the Anthony case as evidence that the justice system was flawed. The case had created lasting skepticism about acquittals, regardless of evidence. Quality in other cases. The psychological impact on the Anthony jury became a subject of study, as members reported ongoing harassment and threats years after the verdict. Several jurors expressed regret about their decision, not because they believed Casey was guilty, but because of the personal cost of upholding constitutional principles in a nationally divisive case. The Anthony family's disintegration continued in the years following the trial, their private grief becoming public entertainment as media outlets documented every development. George and Cindy Anthony's marriage survived, but their relationship with Casey did not. Public statements suggested years of estrangement, with the grandparents maintaining their belief in their daughter's innocence, while expressing inability to forgive her behavior. Casey Anthony's post-trial life became a study in permanent exile. Attempts at normal employment were sabotaged by public recognition and employer fear of customer boycotts. Romantic relationships ended when partners received death threats. She moved frequently, using assumed names and disguises to avoid the constant threat of vigilante justice. Television networks and publishers offered substantial sums for Casey's story, but public outrage made such deals commercially impossible. The same public that consumed every detail of her trial through media coverage now boycotted any outlet that provided her a platform to profit from her daughter's death. Mental health experts studying the case noted the unprecedented nature of Casey's post-acquittal existence, legally free but socially imprisoned, acquitted but never exonerated in public opinion. Her situation represented a new form of punishment that existed outside the justice system's traditional boundaries. The wooded area where Caylee's remains were discovered became an unofficial memorial site. Strangers continued leaving flowers, toys, and notes for a child they had never met but who had become a symbol of innocence lost. The site's transformation from crime scene to shrine reflected the public's need for a place to grieve what they perceived as justice denied. Orange County officials struggled with the ongoing cost of security and crowd control related to Casey Anthony's continued presence in Central Florida. Her mere existence in the community required police resources and generated protests that disrupted normal civic functions. The case's impact on George and Cindy Anthony extended beyond family relationships to their basic ability to function in society. Employment became difficult due to constant media attention. Social relationships ended as friends chose sides in the family's public destruction. Their victimization continued years beyond Caylee's death and Casey's trial. More than a decade after Caylee Anthony's death, the case continues to resonate through American culture as a touchstone for debates about justice, media influence, and the burden of proof in criminal law. Legal schools use the trial as a case study in circumstantial evidence and the challenges of prosecuting cases that capture public imagination but lack conclusive proof. The forensic techniques that played central roles in the prosecution, hair death, banding analysis, and decomposition chemistry, remain controversial in criminal courts. Subsequent cases involving similar evidence have cited the Anthony trial as precedent for excluding scientific methods that lack widespread acceptance in the relevant scientific community. Caylee's law has been enacted in various forms across multiple states, creating criminal penalties for parents who fail to report missing children promptly. The legislation represents one of the few tangible legal changes resulting from public outrage over the Anthony case outcome. True crime media has transformed Caylee Anthony into a permanent fixture of American criminal folklore. Podcasts, documentaries, and streaming series regularly revisit the case, often reaching conclusions about guilt or innocence that the legal system could not definitively establish. Each retelling reignites public debate about the verdict and its meaning. The case established new precedents for social media's role in criminal proceedings. The extensive online discussion of evidence and theories during the trial demonstrated the challenge of maintaining jury impartiality in the digital age. Subsequent high-profile cases have incorporated lessons learned about managing public opinion in the Internet era. Academic studies of public reaction to the Anthony verdict have revealed deep cultural divides about the nature of justice and the purpose of criminal trials. The disconnect between legal outcomes and public expectations has influenced jury selection, media coverage policies, and public education about constitutional protections. Casey Anthony herself remains a figure of permanent controversy, occasionally surfacing in news reports about civil lawsuits or attempts at normal life. Her story serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of criminal law, media attention, and public emotion in contemporary America. The legacy of Caylee Marie Anthony, a 2-year-old whose death became a national obsession, endures as both a symbol of innocence lost and a reminder that the American justice system demands proof beyond reasonable doubt, regardless of public opinion or emotional truth. Her case continues to challenge fundamental assumptions about guilt, innocence, and the price of constitutional protection in the court of public opinion.